Yeah, I mean, you said something when we pull up. Yeah, when the police pull up, an announcement went out through the camp.
Yeah.
You could hear them chiming to let people know that the police were here.
Yeah.
Nobody came out to greet us, so I can tell it wasn't because they were happy that the police were here and bring out the welcome mat. Like, why else would I asked myself, why else would somebody be announcing the police are here, but for probable criminal activity?
And so we're dealing with all of the sorts of things you would imagine in a lawless place. Within the camp itself, we're dealing with drug overdoses. We're dealing with assaults
associated with the drug trade,
stabbing, shootings, thefts,
sexual assaults.
I personally responded to one stillborn baby in one of the tents. Mm-hmm. And so just a nightmare in the camp. And so that's all happening. The police response, which because there's not it was on city property, so it wasn't like there was a house right next door. And so the calls we're getting there are from residents, or they are from city employees at the transit across the street or whatever. But it's safe to say we're not getting a call for everything that happens in there.
Right.
Right. So when we get called in there, we are wading into this mess without all the intel. And so that's all happening. There's an illicit drug trade, like you mentioned. And then in the midst of all this, the state of Washington has what we refer to as the Blake decision, which now on top of everything else, the Blake decision complicates our work. How?
The drugs in my pants aren't my drugs, not my pants case. Yeah. It complicates things because it de facto made drugs, hard drugs, legal. We didn't have a crime to enforce when somebody had drugs. So it went from, at least people would hide their drug use from us, to being in the open. Now, we weren't necessarily seeing in the open the dealing, but walking up to tents with somebody actively shooting drugs in their veins, regular.
Right.
Smoking drugs out in the open, like, you can count on it daily.
Yeah. Which, if you walk back through the 2 decades before, like, we've gone a long ways, maybe not in the right direction, from when I first started, like, we were writing search warrants on the odor of burning marijuana.
Right, yeah.
And now we are walking by people injecting hard drugs into their veins, and we have no enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, different podcasts, that I worked narcotics for a bit of time. When I went into that field in 2001, we targeted people that were trafficking drugs. So if you were a drug dealer, you got usually 3-4 years for a delivery of drugs. And a term for a detective at that time was about 4 years. So generally, if you did a case, built up a case, sent a drug dealer to prison, usually, they weren't getting out until you were done with your term. So I did my first term, and the drug laws, they started reducing the sentencing from years to months for drug dealing. And I remember on my last term, must have been around 2010, let's say, that a partner of mine built a case on somebody, convicted them of drug dealing, and they went off to prison and came back within the same calendar year, built a case, and sent them away for drug dealing again, and they were out before we completed our term. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the war on crime. I've never seen a war on crime in my career. I haven't seen a campaign or money that has supported a campaign for a war on drugs. But I have seen the product of being more lenient. And the Blake decision was, I would say, a critical failure in our state as an experiment of what it would look like to make drugs not completely, I should say, there was some nuance to it, de facto legal for people to use out in public area or to have.
So now we're dealing with this huge encampment that the city's scrambling to try and figure out, that has this lawless anarchy taking place within its walls or fences. We have no ability to enforce, no real ability to enforce illegal drug use, which probably a separate podcast, is the nexus to a lot of our criminal activity. And so we have like this perfect storm of problems sitting on top of the perfect storm that created the camp. And so while all this is happening, the neighborhood around, the residential and business area around the camp has lost its patience with this temporary thing that has now lasted 2 years, going on 3 years. And so the community starts to show up at city council meetings within the city government by the hundreds.
Yeah, they're rightfully upset.
They are upset.
They are held hostage in a way, like they have their business or home where it's been, and then this was brought in. So they're righteously upset about what's spilling over into their area.
Right. And so what's happening is the campers are cutting through the backside of the fence. And in order to do that, they're cutting through a business, and they're going out into the neighborhood, which historically has a high crime rate anyway. And so now this neighborhood who's been plagued with high crime is dealing with this influx of high crime on top of the crime that they're already experiencing. And so everybody's really upset.
Yeah, things of high value for these people are walking away.
Yeah.
And things of low value, like garbage, are floating down in replace. So not only do I have to, a business owner has to go out and see that the copper piping is missing to their AC unit that they have to fix, but there's piles of garbage now left behind, or feces.
Not to mention the camp can only support so many people, and eventually, as years go by, not everyone's welcome in the camp, or not everyone wants to be in the camp. And so smaller offshoots of the camp, because the camp is the central hub of resources, all the food drop-offs and everything else, the daily resource collection is at the big camp. And so people don't want to go far from there. And so you have small camps set up on city property in other places, like the RV dump station that became like the summer spray park, where people are filling their water in the non-potable water and setting up camps, and just like big takeover of smaller encampments. And that's all happening, and it comes to a head, and the city council chambers are packed with hundreds of people, standing room only. Side note, the AC broke that summer, and so it's 100 degrees in the council chambers, and everybody's crabby, and the community's screaming for answers. And so as a response, the police department takes the ownership of, well, while they figure out what to do legislatively, what can we do? Well, we can respond acutely to the criminal activity. Our resources on patrol are hugely limited, right? We have a high call volume, and so our ability to do much more than respond to calls for service is hampered by our staffing. And so our agency then, and I'm in the command staff at the time, I'm the patrol commander at the time, we decide we will staff overtime patrols. So we staff foot patrols, bike patrols nightly. And it was like fish in a barrel. So every night for months, we had officers on foot patrol who were just walking the neighborhood around like the old days. And we're catching burglaries in progress. We're catching countless trespasses. We're recovering stolen vehicles, you name it. And so we, within a month, have a huge impact on the crime in the community, because we are just putting the hammer down. And it was expensive, because we're staffing, high dollar overtime night after night after night for multiple people, and nobody's working alone. And so it was hugely effective, though, in curbing the acute problem of crime. And that wasn't sustainable because it was so expensive, but we did see, after, let's say, a month of that, it became harder to go out and catch some of these criminal acts in progress. And so that's all happening while the city's also working on a transition of the camp to something else. And so do you want to talk about that?
As the city was working on a plan to have more of an improved area, more of a defined area, and they looked at these pallet homes. And part of that transition, one of the community outreach organizations started staffing one of their outreach people inside the camp. And that started happening once we had one of the phases of transition was removing people from the larger area, putting them to a smaller area, defined area, to get a better head count, to start walking in some rules that needed to happen for some semblance of order. This outreach coordinator person was put there by a nonprofit organization to try to engage in some outreach to help us out, as us being the city and the police, to facilitate out the resource. The city is working on contracts like what's going to be the best type of defined area, say this housing. So they decided to go with some tiny homes, and that required the facility to be upgraded. You couldn't just put these tiny homes on ground, the mud that was there. Place had to be literally excavated, and Phil brought in blacktopped and ready to roll with these. I think there's room for 50 units of these tiny homes, pallet homes. So that became the next step for the city. But while that was also happening on the facility wise, the police department brought in a behavioral health unit. That's kind of when they started.
That's your unit now,
which is who I'm with.
It's in infancy
now,
yeah. And
it looks a lot different now than it did then. Day one, they didn't really have a defined space for themselves. There was a cubby of an office that had been used at one point, then remodeled for something else, then was kind of a catch-all. We all have those corners and drawers in our homes, and that's what this area was like. There's rooms for some desks. So 3 contract employees from a local mental health agency contracted with us. They were not our city employees, but they were people that were vetted to be co-responders with us, us being the police officers out there on the street. And they were given the broad mission from the administration to help us when we come across people that are in crisis, but the tools that we have around our tool belts aren't going to solve the problem. We're not going to be able to handcuff our way out of this mental health crisis. That's silly. We need your help to bridge that gap. So that started. And what we found is another layer of bureaucracy that happens. So you have a non-governmental operation, which was the employer of these crisis responders, working with a governmental operation. And not always do those two types of organizations work well together. Mm-hmm. Government tends to go slow and it's fixed in its ways. And the private businesses oftentimes have more flexibility for operation. But they're driven more by dollars and cents, where the governmental operations generally has a defined budget to work within. Mm-hmm. And